a sharing screen that you can see with the main part of the screen obviously being the slides. You'll see myself and then Chris Widgwell later, who's going to do the main bulk of this talk in the video in the top right hand corner, and hopefully you will be able to hear us clearly. Ideally, if you have headphones, particularly if you're in a noisy office, that's even better, but obviously if you're on speakers, that's fine. As a participant, you're very welcome to make comments at any stage in the chat box beneath my picture, and that can be shared with everybody. And if you have any questions specifically for Chris in particular, then just pop them in the Q&A box, and then at the end of his talk, which will be about 15 minutes, I will look at the questions and field them for Chris. So we'll try and answer as many of your questions as we can. Usually we get more than we can answer, but hopefully we'll get through as many as possible today. And we can always, if there are questions hanging over at the end, can always then send you an email or follow up afterwards. But today we're focusing very much on proof of concept as a subject. Oh, just by the way, this is being recorded, so if you do put comments in the chat box, they will end up in the recording. And of course, if you're watching the recording, you don't have the opportunity to input into the boxes because it's too late. But for those of you who are on live, welcome again, and do put in comments as we go through. So, as I was saying, this is part of a year in the life of the implementation of Wise Working. And we're at this critical stage now of having, in the first two webinars, talked about setting it up, getting support for it, initiating, understanding what it is we're trying to achieve, looking at the business objectives. Now we're getting to the stage of, if you like, where the rubber hits the road, where actually we now need to work out, is this going to work? Can we now try out some of the ideas? And that's where my colleague Chris comes in. Chris needs little introduction to many of you. He's been around the flexible working, teleworking field for almost as long as I have, so that's a good quarter of a century. We've known each other from his days when he was running the flexible working program in Mercury, and now obviously as a director of WiseWork. So welcome, Chris, and I'll hand over to you for the bulk of the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Peter, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. I'll just adjust my screen a fraction. Okay, as Peter suggested in the previous webinars, we covered various topics. In the previous one, Tony mentioned the draft project plan and drafting that project plan. We're at the stage now where this plan needs to be completed and obviously updated as time goes along. Importantly, the plan has to be agreed by everyone concerned, including all those stakeholders that we previously identified. That carries them along with the program, keeps them informed. A key part of the project plan, of course, is to include things like baseline measures, which I'll cover in a bit more detail in a few minutes. The plan itself has to identify exactly who is to undertake what actions and when by. So a very simple schematic here, key action areas with repeated titles for every one of the areas you're working on. Maybe highlight in the plan perceived areas where there might be risks or problem areas that need to be addressed more fully. Look at the resources you need and integrate those in. And the resources, of course, include not just the technology, stationery and so on, but people's time as well. And maybe you have to work on getting time allowed for those people to stop what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, take part in the project, maybe one day a week, and then carry on with business as usual as well. Maybe someone carrying some of their workload if it's a heavy air time. You have to highlight all the areas that are going to be critical on the critical path throughout the project. If any of those fall down, then you could be in trouble or risk delays. And delays do happen. That's the way work is, so do build in contingency, maybe some flexibility in time allowed or the resources you need. At various points as well, you need to put in progress checks. Are we still on track? Especially if you're having to report interim support reports maybe every month to senior management on how we're getting on. One thing that people tend to forget, and which we've come across several times, is that everyone has to be able to access the project plan. Lowest common denominator may be an Excel spreadsheet, which is fine, but if you're using bespoke project planning software, can everyone use it? Does everyone have access to it? Do they know how to make it work? If not, then they may not be able to take a full part in what you're doing. Throughout the project plan, one strand is vitally important and carries on right from the start right through to the end and beyond, and that's communications. It's vital to the project. It's a key strand running throughout the whole scheme. Carefully managed, these communication programs can inform people in the organisation and maybe your suppliers about what is going on, why the project is being undertaken, what is required of people and resources and when they have to provide that, and that's quite important. Generally, what to expect and when to expect it. Importantly, the communication plan can be used to manage people's expectations. Word does get around very quickly once you start piloting all these different work styles, and some people think, well, actually, I want some of that as well. Now is not the time for them because we're just testing it to make sure it's working okay, that it is actually relevant to the business we're working in and will support our business objectives as well as meet people's expectations. So managing that and just saying, actually, we're just piloting at the moment in key areas. Based on the result of those pilots, we will then start rolling it out into your areas and elsewhere. So just wait a little bit and be patient. The media you can use varies quite a lot, and in various client projects that we've worked on, we've used newsletters internally, email of course, in-house social media, which is a growing area within companies at the moment, newscasts, we've used lunchtime information sessions, which are quite good in small work groups. In some organisations we've actually had small leaflets on tables in the staff restaurants and areas where they may congregate, like the coffee machine, just to get the conversation moving and people thinking about, well, maybe I could do things a little bit differently here, or what does it actually involve, where do I get more information. If your automation systems allow it, maybe put inserts into payslips, although with computerless payslips these days that's not always possible. You can also use things like questionnaires built up within the plan, and maybe the good old suggestion box as well, and just get people's input on a fairly early stage. But you can never communicate enough. It's an ongoing thing. Now, I mentioned baseline measures when we talked about the project plan, and these are critical. Accurate data on the current position does enable you to measure progress more relevant to what you're doing. If you get these wrong, or the wrong measures in place, then you could be off track by quite a wide area at the end of the project. The sort of measures that we've seen people include some of these like desk occupancy and meeting room usage, maybe seeing a baseline for that and then seeing can we increase that at all, maybe more people using one desk rather than one per desk. Obviously sickness and absent rates, staff retention, and all these, by the way, have cost factors built into them. So if you can keep these down, generally operating costs can be kept down. Maybe how much do people spend on their commute journey now? And if they're working in different places, might that be reduced, especially if you're paying some of those charges yourself? Efficiency, productivity, performance, and there are wide ranges of measures here which various people use, but again they can indicate whether doing this new style of working will help people do their jobs more efficiently. Time spent with customers and clients, and examples we've worked in include the obvious ones like Salesforce personnel, more time in the selling environment, but also in local government, people like social service workers spending more time with their clients rather than back in the office. The time to require to perform specific tasks and functions, maybe they can be sped up a little bit by using more efficient technology and more efficient working styles. And of course network usage, IT usage, quite important because that's part of the infrastructure equation. You have to know where you're going to need that most of all. You can use these baseline measures all the time, but the key thing is they are measures of success. So before that can happen, you have to understand what you yourself mean by success, and then make sure that everyone around you, everyone involved in the program, shares the same idea of what success should look like. The baseline measures should then be able to tell you whether you're actually achieving that or not. Now, part of the project plan can take into account external factors, external information, data, and things like case studies will help here. They can show what has worked, has not worked, and why in other similar instances. So let's say you work in petrochemicals. Don't discount case studies from the not-for-profit sector, because often they have the same problems, the same issues, the same job functions, and what they have done in their sectors may in fact be relevant to you within your own sector, within your own organisation. Think about how they measured success. Is that something you could adopt in your own program? Think about what procedures and technologies were found to be relevant to given working situations, to specific jobs, to specific groups and teams working together, what worked best for them, what didn't work. You can use case studies as well internally, so if you have a few little bonfires burning within your organisation, maybe you can write those up as well and use them within your communication plan to help spread the word. But make sure they are relevant to what you're trying to achieve in the current project. The sources of case studies are quite broad, quite varied. The professional bodies publish their own, so CIPD in the HR environment, BCS in computing and so on. LinkedIn groups, often you'll find links to various case studies put up in those. Your consultants' own client references, and these are quite useful, especially as they're fairly fresh. The Office of National Statistics does now produce quite useful data on the bigger picture and how many people are actually working at home and so on. National organisations like Workwise UK and the trade associations themselves also publish various types of case studies, as well as the Trade Union Congress, the TUC. So you could use all of those, but again, the key thing is make sure it just informs you and gives you a better picture of what you might be able to achieve within your program. Having got your project plan there and the communication plan running, now's the time, as Peter said, for the rubber to hit the road. We start looking at how we can test the concept, and running pilots is probably the best way. We've been involved in a lot of these with clients in the past, and some work, some don't work, but it's important to learn from both situations. It does help you test out the new working practices, the new procedures in management concepts and so on, before formally introducing them elsewhere in your organisation. You can run a single pilot, or perhaps more preferably a range of pilots in different parts of the business to get a better feel for different approaches and what might be relevant. Each one, though, should run for a very specific period of time, which should be reflected back in your project plan. If it doesn't work, and maybe expect it not to work in some cases, then mid-pilot evaluations are quite important, again using those baseline measures to enable you then to think, well, okay, it's not working here, do we need to make changes now in the pilot before we relaunch it and run to completion to see if they work. Write up summaries of the pilots, because again you can use them within your communications plan, and I quite like to see sometimes write-ups of pilots that have not worked or have struggled, because if you can find out why, that's part of your learning process, and it informs other groups who may then want to follow suit so they don't repeat the same problems and mistakes. You may well find small groups already working at home or working on the move in your organisations, perhaps informally using their own technology and so on. If you can find out how they were working, maybe invite them to be involved in the pilots or even become one of the pilot groups, principally because they will want to help you make it work, because they want to continue working in the same way and enjoy the same benefits. So having run your pilots, it's now the point where you evaluate them against the original plan using those all-important baseline measures. You can obtain feedback in various ways. Questionnaires are very useful, but make sure they reflect the sort of information you need and are not too generic. Interviews, either one-on-one or one in a group, maybe a small group workshop to get feedback on how people viewed the pilots, what they thought worked, what didn't work, suggestions for improvement and so on, before you start rolling out properly. That may involve as well information and feedback from other stakeholders who weren't initially involved in the pilots, but who have been affected in some way. Maybe some of the people in the pilots delivered services to them. Did that service improve or not? It's important too to think about online surveys, internal polls. I've seen some organisations use things like SurveyMonkey within their organisation just to field very small, very quick, short polls for people to fill in and gather more information. At the end of all that, of course, you need to write it all up, because at some point you're going to have to approach senior management and ask them whether we can actually implement this sort of style of working across the organisation or in very specific areas of the company or the organisation itself. So that go-no-go decision will be based on this evaluation. And again, if you've got success measured against your baseline measures, you should be able to prove that it's a viable option, that it will have benefit for the business as well as everyone else concerned. In conclusion, by running these pilots, properly managed, properly led, you should hopefully be able to prove that the concept works. Maybe not as you originally conceived, because you've adapted a little bit and changed. It should inform this report to senior management with the recommendations about what to do next. So hopefully you can then roll out your WiseWork project to other areas. They may come back, of course, and say run a few more pilots because you're not happy with things, but be prepared for that and just tweak the plan accordingly. The pilots, when you run them, are a very effective way of engaging employees and line managers in the concepts and the program. They do help to get their buy-in and their support not only now but ongoing. And we've often seen that some of the people involved in the pilots actually become your internal champions, and they help you to promote the whole program to other parts of the organisation. In some cases, they may even lead other pilots in other areas, or act maybe as ambassadors, helping people move into a new building with new work styles, other sort of ways of helping you. So you need to keep them on your side. As Peter said, the next webinar will start to look at how you then use all this to begin implementing the program formally across the organisation. So ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for your time, and this leaves about 10 minutes, I guess, for questions and answers. Back to Peter.
Great. Okay, Chris. Well, if you stay on as well, we can, between the two of us, hopefully field the questions that have come in. Thank you very much. Several have come in already. And do keep putting them in, and there's another one's just come in as well, so do keep posing them over the next just 10 minutes that we have. First one is around balancing people's expectations with meeting business needs. So I guess this, Chris, is around do you end up, particularly when running a pilot, with people expecting to be able to do things only to find that actually they'd love to work at home 7 days a week or something, and they obviously can't because there are restrictions, and that the pilots set unrealistic expectations. How do you, and they have to be pulled back because of business needs. How do you manage that?
I think the key thing is to be totally open and honest with everyone involved. If you're running a pilot that does involve home working, then you may have to tweak someone's terms and conditions of employment specific to that, just to say, actually, it's only 2 days a week during the pilot. You may have to work at a client site for another day, but you'll be expected to be back at the main base, the main office, or wherever it is for the rest of the time. Other ways of doing it maybe are to specify team time. So whether people then come together, maybe in a hotel that we've seen, for example, just to touch base with each other. But I think you have to be totally open and honest with everyone up front at the very beginning, so they realise it's not going to be 7 days a week at home. And I would fight that anyway, because of things like working time regulations and all sorts of other things that you have to consider, and burnout. As a general thing, we find that people, when they do work under these situations, do tend to work longer hours, harder, and well, they're more productive as well. And you have to manage that as well, in different
Okay, good.
ways.
Thank you very much. There's a question come up under the chat. Thank you, Shirley. Which actually was already a question in the Q&A, which was choosing areas for pilots. So the question is around: do you choose some, a group where it's fairly easy? We've seen this happen, haven't we, Chris? Where it's the IT department that are behind it. So they've got a new kit, they experiment with it, and everybody else says, "Well, you would, wouldn't you?" So what's your advice on start with a difficult area, or do you choose an easy area, or how do you make a choice as to where to pilot?
I think my experience, you need a bit of both. And obviously, when you're gathering that information, formulating the plan, you might well find through questionnaire feedback or whatever, a small group that's actually doing it themselves already, or individuals doing it themselves. Maybe it's not managed properly. The company may not even know it's going on officially, and that raises other issues, of course, health and safety and insurance and so on. But if you can find those, maybe if the business can allow them to do that, that could be one of the pilot groups that you use. In other areas, there might be a business imperative to try it out in different areas. And I mentioned Salesforce is an obvious one. In the past, I've worked in organisations where they're actually reducing their office space, so the sales teams themselves won't have their glorious one per desk anymore. It's just a team space, and that obviously needs a different method of handling. Again, honest with them about what we're trying to do. But there may be a business need. We're going to get rid of your offices by such a date, so you've got to be able to move on. I remember British Airways. We did that with them 15, 20 years ago now, when they were beginning to move into Harmondsworth. A specific date for their building to close, so everyone had to have undergone a specific training program, which is actually included in a passport mechanism that we introduced. And we focused on those areas first, and then rolled it out later to other areas that had less of a business imperative, less of a deadline to meet. So there are various things you can do, but you have to take into account the situation as it is and what that business imperative might be.
That ties in with another question, which is around taking the message on. It's a question about who's responsible for carrying on the message from the pilots in terms of then driving it out into the rest of the organization. Maybe this is slightly getting ahead of ourselves in terms of the next stage, but it is to do with communicating the results. So who should be doing that is the question.
Again, it's a mixture. If you have a program leader, a project manager, obviously they are the driving force. But I mentioned these champions as well, and they play quite an important part in this process, especially if they're senior level champions. And we've seen that quite often, where maybe a board director thinks, well, actually this works for me, I will actually do this myself. And they become the promoter in effect. They see the benefits for themselves, see their productivity increase, whatever it is, and want that to roll out through the rest of their department, their division, or their business as well. Combination. You may have external suppliers as well who can provide some of that driving impetus, but you do have to keep that impetus moving. The communication plan is the key mechanism for doing that. But if you've got that authority to go ahead, that go decision, hopefully that will specify who the main driver is behind
Yes, there was a question came in fairly near the beginning about who, when you were on talking about the project plan, was saying who drives the project plan. Is it HR, IT, or a dedicated project manager?
Well, generally, if it's a fairly complex thing, I think some of the local authorities that we've done work for, they do form a project team with a project team leader. So they are the focal point, the central hub, as it were. Um, it can, of course, delegate these to if it's a very big program. So you have, a second tier of people driving that through, but the ultimate responsibility then goes back to the project leader, as agreed by the board of directors or the senior leadership team. Um, they will need some time allocated within their workday to actually do that, and that's a consideration that people tend to forget. It's not just another chore on top of what you do already, because I mentioned burnout, and we have seen that happen quite often sometimes. So yeah, you just need to think about
Okay,
that.
time for probably one more question. We have a question about baseline measures. Have you got any information showing how
Yep.
baseline measures are improved in running a pilot? I think that's quite a little bit about, well, what sort of things do you measure, I guess, and do you come up with evidence that shows that things are improved?
Um, yeah, and I'm typically you might have a dozen good baseline measures to go against. Um, so providing you get them accurately measured to start with, measuring how they change at frequent points should then become part of the process. Um, I mentioned things like staff retention. That's fairly easy to measure over maybe a half year or something. Um, time spent with customers or clients is fairly easy to measure as well. Um, Generally, they shouldn't be too complex. I think they need, to be sensible. They do need to be measurable. Well, we'll talk about smart and smarter targets, of course, and that's part of it. Um, but they have to be relevant to what you're trying to achieve. So if you're trying to maybe reduce people's time in the office, some of those baseline measures have to be built around that concept. If it's more time in front of people, again, that needs to be reflected in there. It's just improving the way you do your job, and different measures are then applied to it. Um, Many organisations have these measures in place already, although they may not be universally used, or even people may not be aware they're there. So again, part of your research when you start should be to see, well, what are we measuring already? Can we use some of that? Do we need anything else
Yeah, I
as
guess
well?
in my experience, there's a lot of people say, "Oh, it would be nice to prove that our productivity goes up once we are working in different ways," because often this is one of the reasons for wanting to implement smart, flexible, wise working. And so the first question we often end up asking is, "Okay, so do you measure your productivity at the moment, and can you therefore do a before and after measure?" And very often there's a bit of a silence and say, well, not really that accurately. But having said that,
Yeah,
I think
that's
we've
right.
also experienced that you do surveys of employees and their managers and ask them if they perceive that their productivity has increased. And it may be a bit subjective, but they can often say, yes, I now, the way I work now, I've increased my productivity by X%. And if you get the manager and the employee both saying the same thing, then the chances are there's a bit of truth behind it. Okay. Uh,
Yeah,
right, we're coming
that's
up
right.
to 2:30, so we need to finish off. So, firstly, a thanks to you, Chris, very much for enlightening us on this stage of proof of concept. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Sorry we didn't go out to answer quite all the questions. And those of you who have been at previous webinars will know that we have the recordings available via our website. We are documenting these as we go through the year, so we will end up at the end of the year as a bit of an e-book covering, a year in the life of a Wise Work project. And the next one, most importantly, is 26th of July at midday UK time, and that'll be the first one of the three implementing. So we're now getting down to the practicalities of really putting in place wise working. So again, thanks, Chris. Thank you, everybody, for participating, and look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.